Welcome, this is Structure 1515. This is number 2 out of a monthly series that I'm doing, and all the content is from my books. So we're going to go super fast here, and it probably will be too much, but there's always a chance for the conversation afterwards, and also to go deeper or look at this more in the books. The first one is the Primer for Partners, which was published last year. And the second one is coming, I hope, in January. So it's really almost done. And that's the Book for Builders, which is a little bit more for lawyers, but really anyone who deals with the documents. So last month we did Like Rock, Like Water, which was really about stability and flexibility. But this time we're going to talk about the trustee and secretariat distinction. So I've called this the trustee is not the secretariat. And I'll be doing 15 minutes of presentation, and then we'll do 15 minutes of conversation. And since we're such a small group today, if you feel like asking questions or saying anything along the way, please feel free to unmute yourself or, chime in. So the first thing I want to start with, if you can see this tree that's fallen in the woods, is kind of the perennial question. If you don't have a name for something, is it really a thing? And in this particular context, I feel like international partnership programs really are worth identifying, exploring, developing a practice area around. And so this has been my passion, is to really give some definition to this area, including some of the terminology. So that includes the term international partnership programs, which is not something I made up. And it's also basically, it is what it says it is, but I think it's helpful to be a little clear before we start on exactly what we're talking about. And so the first part, of course, is we're in international space. And that means it's at least one of the partners is international. It can be a country, the ministries or agencies, or it can be an international organization like UNICEF, where UVA is, any of the UN agencies, or the multilateral development banks. So the World Bank, where some of us have a lot of experience, or international financial institutions. That essentially pitches it into international space, which has lots of advantages. But this particular modality has 2 essential ingredients, the way that I've defined it. And it's really a nice hybrid approach of taking something new, which is a specific governing body. So you have either decision-making or advisory, and you couple that with support from an existing entity. So it's not that the whole thing is new, the partnership pieces are new, but the supporting entity is already out there. And so organizations like the World Bank, or more and more, as I'm seeing, UNICEF and others, can play this support role for these international partnership programs. And that is enough in terms of the definition that I put forward. But for our conversation today, it's usually not enough for these partnerships, because of course partners want to do activities, and that means they need to be funded. And so you almost always, or very often, add a third component, which is some kind of international funding vehicle, typically what we call trust funds. And that too is on the new and dedicated side usually. So you have commingled funding coupled with collective decision-making, both of which are supported by this existing entity. And often it's the same entity for good reason. And we can also be more specific and say that the Secretariat is providing the support primarily to the governing body, and the trustee is providing the support to the trust fund. So this was a slide that I presented last month as well, and then we launched into the stability flexibility. But for today, we're actually going to zero in on this distinction between the Secretariat and the trustee, which the supporting entity is providing. So I'm going to do a few initial observations before going into the specifics. And the first one is that if you have a partnership program, you don't actually have to have a dedicated trust fund. So in those cases, of course, you don't have a trustee that you would talk about within the context of the partnership program itself. But we also had, and so then you're really talking about the Secretariat. But we also have cases that are kind of the opposite, that don't actually have or articulate that they have a separate Secretariat. And then you have partnership programs that really only talk about having a trustee. And in that case, you're basically looking at a trustee support structure. But then there are other cases where you will have potentially a very strong Secretariat. And as it turns out, these trustee functions end up being subsumed into the Secretariat. So you may not even talk about the trustee, you may just be talking about the Secretariat. And then, of course, you have cases where you have both trustees and secretariats, where the trustee is named, the Secretariat is named. And so then you're really on both fronts. And so the reason we're doing this conversation today is like, okay, really, what is the deal? Does it matter? Do we care? And I guess by the end of this, I hope that I will have shown you that it does matter and we should care. And so let me plunge into a few slides on this. When we look at the trustee versus Secretariat, we have these two labels, but the place I'd like to start with you is on the functions, is to really look at functionally what a quote trustee usually is doing versus what a quote Secretariat usually is doing. And it's interesting to observe initially that they are both on the same administrative plane and very frequently part of the same supporting entity. And that's, of course, part of why this confusion arises, because within that entity, choices are being made about what to label, how to label these functions, and it's not necessarily a very disciplined approach. But I think we can broadly say that the trustee is really on the financial management and fiduciary side. As I say on the slide, it's all about the money, baby. So the trustee is focused on the trust fund, and it's doing things like financial management, financial reporting. It's got a strong fiduciary role usually. It might be using funds itself or through its entity or supervising fund use. On the other hand, on the other side of the ledger with the Secretariat, this is where the partnership pieces come in, and also programmatic. So I would distinguish a Secretariat type role, whether you call it that or not, as being things like meeting support, if you have the governing body. And if it's decision making, might also have no objection decisions between meetings. This is usually where the website and communications and brand related things are being done, like the annual report. And ultimately, this is a whole chapter in my book, something that doesn't get talked about much, but this is really where this custodial role arises. The Secretariat type functions is kind of the catch-all for whatever else needs to be done in the partnership, things that we may not have articulated, may not even know will be coming down the pike. And fortunately, we have a Secretariat to take care of some of those things. But of course, we do have a lot of cases where the trustee is the Secretariat, or the Secretariat is the trustee, or we don't even distinguish between the two. And it's not to say, I want to be really clear, it's not to say that that's a bad thing. In fact, it is a very powerful modality in the international community. And here what we're doing is, we kind of blend these two things. We get rid of the distinctions. We might even call it an administrator, give it a kind of generic label instead of even recognizing the independent functions. And some of you on the call, actually all of you except Claire, because we really have a strong World Bank contingent today, or almost all of you, are going to recognize this. I call it a one-stop shop that's provided by the supporting entity. But this is effectively what IBRD IDA trust funds are. This is this kind of blended approach, and we might use different labels, but ultimately it's a one-stop shop, and it's a full service package where the trustee and Secretariat roles are blended within the same entity. And again, a great modality, and in some ways doesn't really require the discipline of separating them out. But I still would like you to understand what the distinctions are, because then it becomes much easier to think about structuring and design questions. So if we draw the line again and talk about this, not from the label perspective, but really what's going on structurally and also legally, the key element that makes a strong distinction is the trustee on the money side of things is going to be much more deeply embedded in contractual relationships. And that's really in the nature of fund flows. Donors are not going to flow funds without having obligations, breachable obligations with fiduciary responsibility somewhere along the line. And in that context, the trustee ends up acting in this contractual setting where it's a party as a principal for itself. So it is arm's length, but it is taking on these obligations. And that forces the trustee to effectively look inward and to be more focused on its own institution, because it's got a risk profile, it has a liability profile, and it's a custodian for the funds. It has a fiduciary role. So managing the trust fund really puts it on a contractual plane, acting for itself as a principal. By contrast, in these international partnership programs, it is unusual, and Uwe, you may have some insights for us as to how UNICEF is handling this, but it is not as customary for the Secretariat role to be contractually bound. It could be through the trustee agreements, but very often these roles are more, the Secretariat role, especially custodial piece of it, is much more of a structural engagement. It's the Secretariat supporting entity coming in as a partner. It's that agent role where the Secretariat is the legal entity function for the entire partnership. And so it's acting as an agent on behalf of partners. It necessarily is looking outward as much as it's looking inward, because it's looking towards the partners, towards the governing body. It's got a brand function. And I describe it as essentially a partnership custodian. So even though the labels might not tell you as much, and even when you don't have labels, trustee roles and functions are distinct from what I characterize as Secretariat type roles. One focused towards the trust fund, one towards the governing body, but one also more inward and the other more outward. So I'm going to just show you an image from my primers, which shows that in a very rudimentary fashion. You have the trustee and the Secretariat in the supporting entity. So that's this existing support base. And the Secretariat is, on the one hand, embedded inward, and it's also linked to the trustee. But at the same time, it has this outward relationship towards the governing body and the partnership as a whole. What I call the hybrid in and out for the Secretariat function. And here's an image for my book for builders, which is not yet available. So you are getting this, early preview, where I'm picturing the Secretariat trustee axis. Again, they're on the same administrative plane, often in the same entity, but one is contractually bound primarily, and the other is structurally engaged. One has the financial focus and the other the partnership focus within the larger partnership governance and brand on the upstream, and activities and results on the downstream. So having said all of that, I think there's nothing like a real life example to think about what are the implications of this and why does it even matter? Because most of the time, honestly, it might not matter, because most of the time things are just running smoothly, but sometimes tensions will arise. And the IRL in real life, I am so excited that Jane Kirby-Zaki is in this meeting, because no names will be named, no fingers will be pointed, but I think you'll recognize this example immediately. This is a case that's, I would say, historic by now, but we spent literally more than a year figuring this out, dealing with tensions that were arising. It's a situation here, this real life example, where we had a Secretariat that included a program head. Perhaps worthy of note that this program head came from outside the supporting entity and was very closely linked to one of the donors, so brought a very strong donor focus. Within this Secretariat, so this is a strong Secretariat example, the trustee functions were essentially wrapped up in the Secretariat. And so the trustee task manager, which was responsible for all the representations and all the management of the trustee, was actually reporting to this program head, so was part of the Secretariat. So here you had a Secretariat that was essentially taking both functions, was the catch-all for everything this partnership program needed, And over time, partly because of the perspective of this program head, tension started developing between the Secretariat and the supporting entity, particularly around the trust fund. Okay, so with this example, I don't know if any of you have seen something like this or have any initial comments that you might want to make before I talk about what our direct experience was.
Well, I actually have a comment.
Yeah.
Question, because I think you touched on it, and it's something I was thinking about. You know, you touched on the issue about the donor, that the individual manager or the person who was involved was very closely tied to the donor or to one of the donors. So I guess I was going to say, where does the donor role or the donor voice play in this? Because I
Oh,
think
yeah, so that's actually really important. And like I say, I'm going very fast here, so a lot of these things are not so clear on the face of it. So clearly the donors are in the upstream, you know, the money's coming in, and when we think about upstream, downstream is coming in to the partnership. On the one hand, donors are very directly involved in the trust fund. So, you know, you've got the trust fund here, the money's coming in, but what's interesting is that this is one of two collectives, the commingled funding, but the other place the donors are coming in is normally also in the governing body. And so they have a voice to a degree. It might be advisory, but they in these partnership programs where you have these governing bodies, typically donors are a big part of the either decision making or providing influence. And in this particular case, it was considered a really good idea from a resource mobilization perspective, from a donor relations perspective, to have someone close to the donors brought into the program lead, to that program head role. And I mean, there's a lot to be said for that. So clearly there are some advantages. But the way this was structured with this strong secretariat started to, yeah, just create issues over time because of some differences of views and pressures that were coming in from the outside. So maybe I'll just talk about at least two of the things that we came across in the context of this example, where we realized that we might need to make a structural shift, where the structure itself was problematic. So one was that this particular partnership program had a ton of money coming in. It was like the flavor of the year, and suddenly donors were very interested in this particular sector, and overwhelming amounts of money were coming in, like almost larger than a country's GDP. So there was really a lot of donor funding, obviously with a lot of pressure to disperse. But these supporting entities, because they have very disciplined fiduciary roles and very robust operating frameworks typically, because that's what donors think they want, will take their time, and it is very involved to develop these projects, to appraise these projects, and to make sure that they're ready before they get implemented. So donors have all this money and we're pushing for disbursement, and the supporting entity with the trust fund responsibility as trustee was kind of like, whoa, you know, we need to check this and make sure it's all okay. So there was building tension there, and the program head, being in some ways much closer to the donors and pro-donor, was part of putting the pressure on the institution and creating a dynamic vis-a-vis the trust fund. The other thing that didn't actually happen, but that we were very aware of and concerned about, and led us to what we ended up doing ultimately, was that we also started to recognize more and more that there was just an institutional vulnerability in having that trustee function in the Secretariat. And a clear example was if there had been any allegations of fraud, you know, I'm sure UNICEF is the same way. There are procedures that are followed internally, including, you know, investigations and different steps, particularly while the information is still confidential, and it stays confidential for a while before it gets just immediately disclosed. There's a lot of reputational risk involved. We've definitely seen cases where if an allegation is made, it may not pan out. So you don't want it to be disclosed in an uncontemplated way. So we were concerned that with the trustee reporting to the Secretariat head, that the institution would lose its ability to manage those kinds of situations within its policies and procedures. And we just know once confidential information flows to the governing body, it's possible that it will flow further. But in this case, we also had the idea that if it flowed to the program head, that we would also have a bit of a leaky situation. So I guess I would be wondering if anyone has thoughts. Jane, we can always ask you what actually happened, but if anyone has thoughts on how to solve a situation like this, or what would be a good structural adjustment to manage this kind of arrangement.
Andrea, if I'm not mistaken,
and why it matters. Yes, go ahead, Jane.
If I'm not mistaken, you're talking about a program that started with no trust fund, then it developed a trust fund, an IBRD, IDA trust fund, and then it developed a fifth.
Right.
So I think some of these roles kind of were seen as, totally, first of all, there was no money, so nobody was, the decisions weren't about these big disbursement pressures and the kinds of issues that you're mentioning there, because every constituent was, basically financing their own bilateral program and just coordinating together. I don't know, I'm a retiree now, so I guess I can say that I think you're talking about Global Partnership for Education.
Right, so I didn't want to be too specific, but this is in the early incarnation before it became GPE, okay, when it was still a one-stop shop, and it was EFA FTI. Yeah. And I can just, partly in the interest of time, this is what we ended up doing. I mean, it took us more than a year to get here, but we realized that we had to manage a situation where these distinct functions were actually too interlinked, particularly given the nature of the program head and the donor dynamics. This is not going to arise in every case, but it was one of the seminal moments for me to understand why it is worthwhile to distinguish a trustee role from a secretariat role, and that this outward pressure can be problematic when you're dealing with the inward obligations of a trustee. So it was a pretty simple adjustment, but we essentially took the reporting line of the trustee task manager to the program head and shifted it over to a sector manager that was outside of the Secretariat. And so this individual, who I think actually managed just fine, had a somewhat bifurcated existence. When the person was doing Secretariat type activities, which was part of the portfolio, that was reporting up to the program head. But trustee specific activities, things that related to the fiduciary role, if there had been allegations of fraud, would have been reporting outside of the Secretariat. And that gave the trustee role, and particularly the supporting entity, the institution, the comfort that it could manage its fiduciary role, its contractually bound fiduciary role, in a clean and clear way, so everyone would always know where they were, while still allowing for whatever synergies or coordination within the Secretariat. So it just gave enough of a bifurcation in terms of the roles to allow for the nature of the roles to play out, while still keeping a very integrated approach to how the partnership program was working.
Yes. Andrea, just very quickly, I think at the time that you're talking about, maybe the program head was also not from the same organization as the trustee.
Yes, and that was my point, that it was someone brought in from the outside.
And not like even part of the same, not an employee of the same organization as the trustee. The trustee had to operate under policies and procedures, and the program head resisted those because that program head said, exactly, I have no relationship to that. Yeah.
And this would also be a fable or, a lesson learned in terms of who you hire into your Secretariat, particularly your program head. I talk a lot about this in my book, but essentially if you use these existing supporting entities, and so again, I would point to UNICEF, if you use a platform like UNICEF or the World Bank, you can only do so if you respect the existing framework. And if you allow the organization to be itself and to manage its risk profile in the context of the partnership support that it's providing. And usually that is just a beautiful synergy, but it can be challenging if you don't have someone at the head of the Secretariat that is able to navigate the balance that's needed for that. And I guess I would just want to conclude in that sense to say that this axis, the trustee secretariat axis, even if it's two separate organizations, but particularly if it's embedded in one organization, is an extremely powerful and synergistic part of what makes these international partnership programs work so well. It gives you a strong core. It allows you to balance things effectively. It is a really interesting connection between the shared governance through the Secretariat and the fiduciary obligations through the trustee. And what you're doing ultimately is you're meshing the external partner and internal supporting entity dynamics through these roles. And in that sense, you really want individuals who are able to intuit what that balance and what that equilibrium requires. So ultimately, the bottom line is that, if you have a trust fund and a governing body in these international partnership programs, both roles are in play, whatever labels you're using. And each of these roles has its place and its importance, and it's just really good to recognize what those are. So I have actually not left much time for conversation because we've done pretty much a half hour, but I would love to open up the floor and see if anyone has some thoughts or some questions. I don't have a time limit, so.
Yeah, maybe just briefly, I mean, first of all, great to see familiar faces. It's been a while. And without talking about specific UNICEF examples, I think one thing I think is interesting to add, I mean, for your real life example, to add like an additional level of complexity is one thing, if you look at the downstream where the funding goes, right? I mean, especially if you have different things in one entity, like trustee, secretariat, but potentially also the entity being one of the implementing partners, right? I mean, to have a trust fund, the funding flows to different partners, but you as the host entity are also eligible to receive funding from it. I think that's a level of complexity where then you have, in the discussions I was involved in, there's a lot about firewalls that basically then need to be put in place. And how do you keep the trust of the donors and others that you don't see conflicts of interest? How do you manage these things? I mean, how do you, then it comes into other governing aspects, and how do you decide on the funding allocation and others? So I see in these models, in many cases, like the third level to add, trustee, secretariat, and implementing partner, certainly adds another challenge where then it becomes difficult in kind of managing those conflicts of interest and keeping the trust basically in you as the entity. But in many cases, there's no alternative to it because, I mean, yeah, you're so intertwined into what the fund and the program is actually wanting to achieve.
Yeah, it's interesting because the one-stop shop is one of two, what I call mighty oaks in the international community that are out there in terms of models. The other is what I call international platforms. And it's really the full trustee versus the limited trustee distinction. And what that means more specifically is that downstream in a limited trustee, there are certain things you can do to create more diversity on the implementation front. You can also do them with a full trustee, but they're more complicated. And you're absolutely right, Uwe, it just adds a whole additional layer, and there's even more balancing going on. So the theme of my book for builders is balance. And I spend a lot of time talking about the dualities that are at play that have to get balanced. So my longest chapter is all about these different pairings or different relationships that need balancing. And it's just useful to understand them so that when you're looking at certain situations, you kind of know where you are in the landscape and what you're trying to navigate. I wonder, let's see. I have some topics to discuss that we could do for the next one, which is in January. And one of them is the full versus limited trustee. And, taking your comment, I don't know if you specifically meant the limited trustee, but it's also what Jane was alluding to when she talked about GPE versus EFA FTI. That moved from a full trustee to a limited trustee model for some of the reasons that allowed it to balance these things better. So we could actually do January's conversation on that distinction and look a little bit more at the downstream and what some of those dynamics are.
Yeah, and maybe also the conflict of interest aspect, I mean, which at least from the examples I was involved in, was kind of then the point that comes into play if you bring different roles together. Yeah.
So maybe that's actually a nice segue. So if we start with full versus limited trustee, because that will then explain the distinction, and use that then in a subsequent session in February, we could talk about conflicts of interest versus the synergies. I must say the conflicts of interest versus synergies is one of my favorite topics, because I think it's very compelling in the international space, and we could look at that much more closely and see what some of your examples are and talk about how that plays out.
Yeah, just to back up Uwe, I agree. I think that was kind of when our team that was supposed to advise on these things would kind of grind to a halt when somebody came along and said, hey, there's a conflict of interest here. And Andrea, I remember you were very helpful in getting us to think, well, it isn't, it's not that every time an entity is playing multiple roles, especially when you've just signed an administration agreement, which is a contract between you and the donor saying, you're responsible for everything and you will play all these roles.
Right.
To have someone else come along, maybe an evaluator or, one of the donor, somebody could come along and say, you've got a conflict of interest here because you're both the secretariat and the trustee, or both the trustee and the implementer, choose your, and then we would be, completely frozen until we could. I have to say that like my work with the bank now, I think they have really filled in a lot of the holes on trust fund policy and procedure that we used to regularly bump up against. So I think that would be an excellent topic.
Yeah, but interesting for me is that even as the bank has progressed, Uwe, it'd be interesting to hear from you as well. There's still, even just the basic vocabulary is missing to be able to identify these things and to think about it in a coherent way. I would say, for example, and I don't mean this disparagingly, but I think the World Bank has just an allergic reaction to the word secretariat. You say that word and suddenly, it's like this big institutional thing, and it takes away from the trustee role, which is partly the tension with, how much partnering is the bank willing to do in the trust fund space. But I think the reality is, even for advisory bodies, even for the umbrella reform, there are secretariat type roles which are different from trustee type roles along the lines of the distinction I was making. And just having that vocabulary and using it in a somewhat disciplined way so you know what you're talking about is already a really important first step to being able to identify where the tensions are and then think about structural impacts and maybe solutions.
Yeah. No, I mean, in UNICEF, I've been there a while now, 7 years or something. Obviously, we're far from where we were in the bank, a number of trust funds and other things that UNICEF hosts. But I think exactly we also started out with, what models would we have? I think that's where vocabulary is interesting. So I think that was the starting point. What different models do we have? And then basically have like the same language to talk about these things. And with regards to the acceptance of taking on these roles, I think that still comes up. Specifically in context where it's more like the financial intermediary role, right? Where it's like, okay, we serve as the bank account, and basically the governing body then is in charge of selecting recipients and due diligence and other aspects. And even then, at what point in time does the organization absolve itself from saying, if there is then an allegation of misuse or fraud in the receiving entity, the host doesn't play a role because basically we're just the intermediary, right? And I think that's difficult still, because of donor expectations or even the ability of a governing body to then do their own follow-up on a misuse of funds. So I think there's still like some hesitancy to get into the more complex partnership arrangements because of these different aspects.
There is so much to say here. That's why my first book is like 250 pages and my next book is more like 270 pages with narrow margins, because I think the lawyers and the document people can read more. So I packed more content into it. But all themes that circle around and around and, you know, are very intertwined with each other, you know, to work through what this practice is really about and what it takes to structure and design these international partnership programs. Thank you, everyone. Bye.